All right, well, welcome and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for a conversation about the exhibition Long Exposure, A Century of Pictorialism, currently on view at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. My name is Amanda and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the museum. Before we get started, let's go over a little housekeeping first. Today's program is a webinar, which means that everyone's cameras and microphones are automatically turned off. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to do so using the Q&A feature. To open the Q&A, scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should see an icon that looks like two speech bubbles with the letters Q&A. Once you click that, a window will pop up where you will be able to type questions and comments that we'll circle back around to at the end of the presentation. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's discussion, Dr. Hadley Jerman. Hadley is the Eugene B. Adkins Associate Curator at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. In May 2020, she defended her dissertation on art posters in the American West at the University of Oklahoma and has served as a curator at the museum since 2016. Hadley's research interests include art and design of the American West, typography, photography, and Native American art. Thank you for joining us today, Hadley. We're greatly looking forward to hearing you talk about the concept and key images in the exhibit. Take it away.
Thank you, Amanda, so much. That was a really nice introduction. And thank you all for coming today. I hope you all will be able to experience Long Exposure, A Century of Pictorialism in person before it closes at the end of June. And since we can't be in the gallery together, I'm just going to give you a kind of a highlights tour and a little bit of an overview of the exhibition concept, and then parts of the gallery, and then we'll talk about a couple of the images in the show. I should say that the images in this exhibition are all from the museum's permanent collection, so that was a real treat to work within the confines of our permanent collection and put this show together from those photographs. First of all, for those of you who don't know what pictorialism is, I'll go ahead and explain that briefly. It was an international photography movement that began late in the 19th century, and it began in Europe and it soon spread to the United States around 1900. So since its beginning around 1830, photography was generally accepted it was thought of to objectively depict the natural world. It was associated with science. And pictorialist photographers really balked at that idea. They balked at that prevailing attitude. They didn't believe that photography's purpose should be scientific or that it should objectively represent reality. They really sought acceptance for photography as an art form in its own right, like equal to painting but distinct from painting. So how do they do this? Well, it's kind of ironic. They want photography to be accepted as a fine art, distinct from painting, but to do that, they adopt the aesthetics of 19th century painting. So they would do things like, here, let me change the slide. They would use soft focus, like at far left, to create painterly kind of moody images of portraits, kind of intentionally blurry portraits. They would, in the case of the image that was the far left, the image at the far right, depict subjects that we might associate with Impressionist paintings. So in the case of Robert Damaki, this behind the scenes of the opera, it looks like it could be, you would see a Degas painting of that very subject in a very similar style. And then they would also, some of them, engage in a highly controversial activity, which was painting on or manipulating negatives in the darkroom. And someone who did that extensively was Henry Peach Robinson. He really, at the center, he really kind of preceded the pictorialist movement, but he was combining negatives in the darkroom to create these composite scenes like the image that you see here. And I should note that all of the images that I'm showing today are actually in the exhibition. So by 1900, soft focus, limited detail, sentimental subjects, and an emphasis on beauty really characterized pictorial photographs, the work of these photographers who were trying to define photography as a fine art. But the pictorialist movement was rather short-lived. You know, it really takes off in the US at least around 1900, and it wanes in the 1910s. However, despite the fact that it was, you know, a really short-lived kind of phenomenon, it was incredibly influential on not only the aesthetics of photography for the rest of the century, but the way, maybe more importantly, the way that we think about photography, even today. So the focus of this exhibition, my goal really for the exhibit was to think less about, you know, just, you know, pictorialism as a movement at the turn of the century, the early 1900s, and more about a way to demonstrate how pictorial ideas and the aesthetic really had a lasting influence on the history of photography as a whole. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to show you just kind of this is a schematic of the gallery. This is just a screenshot from SketchUp, which is the software that we use to develop exhibition spaces in the museum. So the downside of Zoom is you can't be in the gallery. I guess the upside is you can kind of see behind the scenes to something like this. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the prologue, this section of the gallery, this is the front of the gallery, really the first thing you enter. This deals with the late 19th century, really kind of people who were investigating this distinction between science and art and photography, and were really kind of precursors to the pictorialist movement. And then the next section, Ye Fakers, that's really the work of turn of the century American and European pictorialists, you know, people who were working at the height of pictorialism's fashion. And then as you come around the corner, you run into pictorial approaches to the American West, especially the work of Edward Curtis in the 1910s, and then also pictorialist adoption by Hollywood portrait photographers in the 1930s and 1940s, who kind of recreate this you know, like soft focus and kind of and glamour portraits of celebrities. And then the second wave of pictorialism is in the kind of latter half of the gallery. And these are amateur and professional photographers who, oops, excuse me, go back. These are photographers who are not part of that first group of, you know, pictorialists who are really seeking to define photography as an art form. These are people who are, you know, like you and me. They might be making photographs when they travel, but they also might be professional photographers who are portrait photographers or even news photographers whose work may or may not really be identified as pictorialists per se. In fact, I think some of them would probably roll over in their graves if they knew they were in this part of the exhibition or in the exhibition period. But their work really reflects this kind of interest in composition and stylistic choices and the way that the composition is created and lighting is used that comes from pictorialism. And then in the legacy part of the gallery, this is really the work of contemporary photographers really since the 1980s, and even some photographers working today whose work has reflected or continues to reflect this interest in not only some of the aesthetics of pictorialism, like that kind of soft focus or hazy focus, but also the idea of playing with the photographic image, altering the photographic image into something that is new, a new kind of art. So as you can see from the gallery space, not very much of it is devoted to, you know, early pictorialists, to the height of the movement. Really, my goal was to trace the effects of the movement and its ideas over the course of the century through our collection. So now I think we're going to take a look at some works in the gallery. So first of all, this is, I showed it briefly at the beginning, this is Julia Margaret Cameron's Sir John Herschel from life. She originally made the photograph in 1867, our image, and this is kind of a terrible image on the screen, but it was printed in 1893 after her death as a photogravure. She was a leading portrait photographer of the Victorian period. And here she's picturing Sir John Herschel, who was the era's most noted astronomer. He was credited with originating the term photography. And she first met him in Cape Town, South Africa in 1836. And he was there to chart the Southern Hemisphere stars. Well, Cameron and Herschel become friends. They could become close friends and really lifelong friends. In fact, he mails her photographs. The first photographs she ever sees are photographs that he sends her through the mail. And so you could say that their friendship and that packet of photographs really inspires her to become a photographer herself, inspires her lifelong career. So 31 years after they met, Julia Margaret Cameron makes this portrait of her friend in 1867. And you can see that, you know, it's very blurry. I mean, part of this is because of the terrible image that I'm showing, but it's really kind of a very soft focus. His hair is really wild. He's looking at the viewer, but or at the photographer, but it's not that crisp, sharp focus that we associate with 19th century long exposures where people would have to sit really still, okay? So Cameron likened the task of photographing her friend as an act of prayer. She described Herschel as a quote unquote teacher and high priest. And she really sought through the soft focus in this image and in other portraits of important figures at the time, she sought to record not only his features, but really, quote, the greatness of the inner man, end quote. So while this image predates the pictorial movement, it reflects an interest in showing something with photography that is beyond the surface, that is beneath the surface, something that's metaphorical rather than a literal kind of sharp, detailed image of the sitter's likeness, of his features. Okay. Now, at the same time, well, a little bit later, that you have Cameron making these like softly focused portraits of important individuals at the time. You have Peter Henry Emerson, another British photographer, making highly detailed, sharply focused images of marsh life in England. This is also a photogravure, so it's not the original print that Emerson produced. This was published in the first of 7 books that Emerson created that were about marsh life. And the book was called Life and Landscape on the Norfolk Broads. Broads, yeah. Now, Emerson would not have considered himself a pictorialist. In fact, he might be really annoyed that he's in this show. He was an advocate of so-called naturalistic photography. That is, he saw the purpose of photography as depicting the true facts of nature, as he put it. So he criticized his contemporaries who created artificial, composite, or staged photographs that mimicked paintings. So why did I include this in the show? Well, while Emerson would have denied it, many of his compositions and lighting effects, including here in The Haunt of the Pike, really resemble landscape paintings, especially impressionistic paintings. So look at how this image is framed. You have this great triangular composition. Those trees lead into the horizon line towards the right, and then you have the figure who's fishing here in front of the reeds, right, along the shoreline, the base of this triangular shape, and then the horizon is, basically the bottom third of the image. So he's paying attention to compositional structures that we associate with painting, but he's creating a photograph that he's at the same time considering to be an ethnographic record, not necessarily, well, definitely not art. So it's kind of interesting to me that while Emerson himself would have considered this to be a scientific document in a sense about rural life, his work, his photographs like this established an aesthetic standard that was emulated by his contemporaries who were, pursuing photography as an art form, okay? And in fact, in the 1880s, when he made this image, Emerson was at the center of a controversy about the nature of photography. First, he was criticizing pictorial artifice, making a stand against any kind of image that was manipulated, and advocating for really sharp focus, like you see here, and a simplicity of composition. He even denied that photography could even be considered an art form. But then later he renounced his theories in a pamphlet called The Death of Naturalistic Photography. So, even the same photographer could kind of stand on either side of this debate. What is the nature of photography? What is its purpose? Now, photographers who manipulated their prints by altering them in the darkroom as they developed, were derided in the early 20th century by some proponents of quote unquote straight or naturalistic photography. People who, like Emerson, believed that photographs should be sharply focused or concerned with rendering facts. And they were referred to, the people who would alter their prints, as fakers. So the next section in the gallery is titled E Fakers. And this is a quotation of Edward Steichen, who was an American pictorialist, who in the first issue of Camera Work, which was a periodical dedicated to promoting photography as an art, came out in 1902, and it was produced by the major photographer and promoter of modernism in the United States, Alfred Stieglitz. Well, Stieglitz features Edward Steichen's work in the first issue of Camera Work, and Edward Steichen refers to pictorialists Riley as ye fakers, but he's doing that in kind of a positive way. He basically parodies this derisive term that was used by the movement's detractors. And he argues that long before a photograph was ever, manipulated in the darkroom, at the point that the photographer, controlled the length of exposure in the camera, at that point, it was already a fake, quote unquote, a fake of reality. It's already an interpretation. It's already art. So he was saying that there's no such thing as a photograph that's not manipulated, or an image, a photographic image that is not, a fake of reality, okay? This is actually one of Steichen's works that is in the exhibit. This is a photogravure from Camera Work. So the majority of the early 20th century examples of pictorialism in the exhibition are actually not the photographer's original platinum prints. They are these photogravures, or these kind of like very finely printed images that were published in the journal Camera Work in the early 1900s, like between 1902 and 1912 for the most part. And some of them were tipped in, which means they were inserted by hand. And then the later ones were printed directly on the page. So this is Steichen's photograph of Rodin's sculpture, Balzac, which is a monument to the writer Balzac. And he photographed the monument multiple times. He was well acquainted with the avant-garde in Paris, including Matisse and Picasso and Rodin. And he was a leading figure in the pictorial movement in the United States, really concerned with advancing photography as an art form through emulating painting. Now, this particular image and others in this series moved Rodin, and he said to Steichen about these photographs, he said, quote, "You will make the world understand my Balzac through these pictures. They are like Christ walking on the desert," end quote. I think that's really kind of a lovely way to think about photography as an art form that's also depicting an art form in its own right, okay? Now, I said that most of the prints in the exhibition from this period are photogravures. And what's interesting about camera work is or one of the interesting things about it is Stieglitz, Alfred Stieglitz would put production notes basically at the back of at the end of the magazine, and he would describe the printing process for each of these photographs. And he would, always be careful to note that the photographs were made directly from the photographer's original negative. And he would often say, that they failed to, or they attempted to convey the feeling of the original prints that the photographer would have made, but in some way they always kind of fail to hit that high standard. And we kind of lamented that throughout camera work. And a good example would be in this image. This is a duplex halftone that was published in Camera Work in 1911. In fact, Stieglitz devoted much of that particular issue of Camera Work to the work of Heinrich Kuhn, who was a major pictorialist in Germany. Stieglitz notes that 3 different printing processes had to be used in camera work to reproduce Kuhn's work, because he used such a variety of techniques in the darkroom. They couldn't really reproduce the effect that he was producing in the darkroom with the same printing process with photogravures. So there were 3 different processes that were used, and in this case, it was a duplex halftone, which is kind of like a halftone print that is printed on top of another color. So it kind of creates this appearance of a two-color printing. Now, this photograph really resembles an Impressionist painting, and it's adjacent in the gallery to the work of another photographer whose work was even more echoing, I think, the aesthetics of Impressionism. And that is the work of the leading French pictorialist and commentator, Robert Damaki. He was highly influential in his writings about pictorialism and also about different printing processes. So this is Study. We don't have a date for it. This is actually a posthumous print. It was produced in a portfolio after Damaki's death. And he was, as you can see, interested in altering the surface of the print. So this image would have started out as it was a photograph, and then Damaki used 2 different processes primarily to kind of create this aesthetic that looks really like a charcoal drawing. He would use gum printing and he would use oil printing. And what happens in either of those processes really is that you paint this emulsion on the paper, and as the photograph is developing, as the image is exposed and developing, it's kind of tacky, and there's a period in time when you can kind of like manipulate the surface, and so you can move the print around as it's developing, and so you get this kind of hand-drawn appearance to the gum prints. Now, Damaki justified his approach, that he was altering the negative by saying, perhaps we shall be accused of making photography lose its character. That is precisely our intention. So he was intent on creating something that resembled painting. In fact, he considered printing to be the most artistic part of the photographic process. It wasn't the actual composing the image in the camera. It was what you did afterwards when you were creating the print. Now this, as I said, this is a later print. There's really one exception in this part of the gallery where we have something that was actually the original print by the photographer, and they're really special, and I'm going to show you. It takes some time to show you these. Now, Frederick Evans was a British photographer who photographed Gothic cathedral interiors in soft focus, but with sharp detail, I should say, and adopted the platinum printing process. platinum printing doesn't allow for very much manipulation. And in fact, Evans didn't want to manipulate his images. He was actually a practitioner of so-called straight photography. So he wasn't a pictorialist per se, but he was admired by pictorialists. As you can see, he said, I put his quotation up there, "Photography is photography, and it's in its purity and innocence. It is far too uniquely valuable and beautiful to be spoilt by making it imitate something else," end quote. In other words, it shouldn't emulate painting. It should be, a different medium altogether. At the same time, Alfred Stieglitz said of Evans, quote, "Of the thousands who have photographed cathedrals, none has imbued his pictures with such poetic qualities, coupled with such masterful treatment," end quote. So you have Stieglitz, who's someone who's really a proponent for pictorialism, who is admiring Evans, who is kind of like, adopting this anti-pictorial aesthetic. So Evans derided pictorialists' penchant for altering negatives, yet his images of Gothic cathedrals were really devotionally crafted, carefully devotionally crafted. So, for example, he would visit each cathedral for weeks before he actually photographed it. He would spend hours exposing each negative. So these are really long exposures to get all that detail in the stonework. And that kind of soft light, you can almost see the light is almost like mist through the page, or excuse me, through the print. And his craftsmanship extended to how he displayed these. So something you can't see in the gallery, unfortunately, is what's underneath the mat. So I'm going to show you, this is the entire image. And so all of the gray borders are matted out in the gallery, but this is not actually, this is not a mat. What this is Evans, there's his print, the platinum print, and then he affixed it to these thin layers of paper. So that light gray, and then the light border that's kind of cream, and then the next border that's gray, and then there's another border that's cream. Those are all thin layers of paper. And then in the outer margin, he embossed his initials. Okay, so really the whole thing is Evans, like the artwork as a whole would be this entire image, not just the print that's on top. And this is really what Stieglitz, I think, admired about his work, that there was this attention to the framing, and that it's really kind of an arts and crafts movement kind of thing to do, to attend to the border and how you're going to create this kind of border by hand through these thin layers of paper. But I think what's also interesting about the two Evans images we have on view, and I'm going to show you another one. Now this one, you can see we really had to mat out the layers of paper that the image is affixed to, because there's it's like there's been some sort of staining on it. So it's not really, we wouldn't want to show that. But you can see on the far left, this is what you can see in the gallery. In the center, this is the whole image. And then on the right, I've cropped in on that part that's in the circle in the center, so you can see his emboss, and then these thin layers of paper. So this idea of putting the print on thin layers of paper was actually something that reflected Evans' kind of spiritual ideas. He was interested in the writings of the Swedish scientist and Christian theologian Emanuel Swedenborg, and who described the spiritual and the physical realms as like these thin, permeable layers. And so Evans believed that the veil between these layers, I'm going to go back to the previous image because I think this is a better example of this idea. The veil between this physical and spiritual realm was the thinnest inside cathedrals. And so when you see transparency in his images and these layers of thin paper that each of these prints are mounted onto, those are really like a metaphor for his idea about the interaction between the spiritual and the physical realm. So this idea of transparency. You see light passing through this doorway into the cathedral. It's softly illuminating all of the stonework. And you see these really thin layers of paper it's mounted onto. This is all kind of a metaphor for this idea of the relationship between the spiritual and the physical. And so Evans really interests me. I think he's kind of a both and guy. This makes him interesting. He doesn't really fit in a tidy box. He was both a Protestant and a mystic. He was both adored by Stieglitz, and he derided manipulated images. His subjects are immaterial, they're about light and the spiritual realm, but then they're also physical. They're about, they depict this like stone, heavy stone. And then, he derided the pictorialists for manipulating images, but he removed all of the seats, all of the chairs from these cathedrals that he photographed. So he wasn't against removing objects from the frame. He just did it before he got into the darkroom. Okay, I have to move on. So the West, the next section of the gallery is devoted to the American West, and where photographers like Edward Curtis especially romanticized Native American life in particular. So Edward Curtis, between 1900 and 1930, sought to depict indigenous communities across North America, and he made approximately 50,000 photographs in the field in various communities, which he published, most of which he published, not all of them, in an enormous 20-volume series titled The North American Indian. And Curtis's images are nostalgic, they're romantic. Both, you're seeing two of them in this slide. They depict, they're problematic. They depict Native people as in the past. He would edit out alarm clocks, automobiles, and other signs of contemporary life from his images. He would also edit out any kind of indication that Native people were enduring hardship. So there are these very kind of romantic images of indigenous life that were not a statement of fact. They're art, but they were influential on 20th century perceptions and stereotypes about Native people. And I wanted to include this image. I wanted to show the Auratone, which is the name for these kind of gold images, against the blue wall in the gallery, because it really, our exhibition team did a really great job. The blue in this exhibition it's just a beautiful exhibition. So this is an Auratone, which was a print that was developed on the back of a glass plate, and then it was backed with a metal coating, the glass plate. And so the image is actually behind the glass, and then there's this, or it's on the glass, but it's on the back of this piece of glass. And then Curtis would create these, he would produce these batwing frames like you see here. So this was the frame that was made for the work, probably in 1919. And these were produced really as a way to sell, to make money to sell his portfolios. He would sell these Auratones or gold tone prints. This particular image, The Vanishing Race, was used in it was the first plate in Curtis's volume, The North American Indian, and it depicts a group of Dene, there's Navajo people, riding away from the camera. And you're seeing the reflection of another photograph, or two photographs on the wall behind me in this image, but still you can see how painterly that ridge is in the distance. You can see how soft the focus is. He really kind of manipulated this image to create this kind of nostalgic lament that it suggests, the title says it all. It suggests that Native people are riding, into oblivion. And it visualizes the dominant culture's false perception that indigenous communities would not survive the changes brought about by modernity. But at the same time, he's removing those aspects of modernity from these images. Okay, so amateurs and professionals, well, after Stieglitz and other early pictorialists abandoned pictorialism for the sharp focus and high contrast of quote-unquote straight photography in the 1910s, pictorialism remained popular worldwide, but it was really popular among amateur photographers. So this next section of the gallery kind of features the work of people who were professional photographers, portrait photographers, but also amateur photographers. Show you, let's see. One of whom is James Van der Zee, and James Van der Zee was a photographer of Harlem life in New York City for more than 50 years. He was a professional photographer, really important African-American photographer, and important photographer, American photographer, I should say. By 1917, he had opened his own studio in Harlem. And in the 1920s and 1930s, he depicted the energy and vibrancy of his talented community. So this is a kind of theatrical image that was photographed originally in 1930. You can see his inscription there at the far right. And it was printed decades later. So our print comes from 1978, just a few years really before Van der Zee's death. And it reflects the kind of glamour that you see in Van der Zee's portraits of Harlem. But I think it's an important image to think of, it's an important image that really poses questions about the nature of photography and itself. So we see this woman who's gazing fondly, not at a person, but at a photographic representation of this young man. And the photograph stands in for his presence. And he looks not at her, but he's looking out at us. Meanwhile, in the lower right, I don't know if you can make that out, but there's a magazine on the floor, and it's put in just so we can read the title as it sprawls sideways there across the floor. And the title is True Story. And we know this is a set, right? We know this is a contrived image. It's carefully composed. The lighting is very kind of romantic. Her gesture with the cigarette, kind of in one hand and with her hand on her cheek. It's very theatrical. It's romantic, nostalgic, and the title of the magazine even playfully or wryly comments, I think, on truth and fiction in photography. And I think it also makes us think maybe about memory and about nostalgia, especially if you think about the fact that this print was made decades later, really near the end of Van der Zee's life. So that adds a kind of further layer of complexity if we think about how a photograph or a print of a photograph made later then assumes a sort of nostalgia for an earlier period. Okay. Well, part of the joy in this project was looking at work by photographers who were associated with OU. And one of those was Joseph Benton. So he's probably unknown, off of our campus, and at least in terms of his photography, because we have about 120 images in the permanent collection that Benton made, and I don't know if there are others elsewhere, but he was an OU student who graduated with a music degree in the early 1920s and then traveled internationally as an opera star in Europe in the 20s and 30s under the name Giuseppe Bentinelli. So he was from Kansas, but he became Italian when he went on tour. And then later in 1944, he became a member of the vocal faculty here. Well, while he was touring as an opera star in the 20s and 30s, he made scores of pictorial photographs with a Kodak Brownie camera. And so here at left, you have Venetian Sunset from 1930. And then on the right, one of my favorite photographs in the exhibition, Afternoon Sunshine, from the same year. And these are great examples of the pictorial aesthetic that really was adopted by amateur American photographers who were traveling in Europe at this time. The image on the right is interesting to me, particularly because what you're looking at is a theater in Italy, and it's our view, the view is from the stage. So we're looking out from the stage into the empty opera house, at ranks of chairs and boxes. And Benton performed on this very stage in 1930. He performed as Rodolfo in La Bohème. So we're seeing the auditorium from his perspective. We're almost experiencing it as a performer on the stage. And those shafts of light are like spotlights. And I think, you know, it's just a wonderful photograph, but it's even more wonderful knowing that this is, you know, we're looking at his view. And then this is just one more Benton photograph in the exhibition. There are 4, and I included it because this was one which he was particularly proud of. He made multiple prints of it. It depicts Giovanni Lavandea, who we know that's her name because on the back of some of the prints he wrote her name, but not all of them. And then I'm showing you at the right, this is what's inscribed on the back of the image. And it tells us that he entered the photograph in an amateur photography contest in Milan, and it won honorable mention. And he was particularly proud of this because of there were so many photographs that it was competing against. Okay, I don't have a lot more time, so I'm going to share this image and then I'm going to jump to 2 more works by Oklahoma photographers, OU photographers, and then I think I'd like to show you how to find the exhibition on our website so you can tour it if you're not here in Norman. Dennis Stock is someone who probably might be seem like a strange inclusion in the exhibition. He was a photojournalist and member of Magnum, the photo agency. And he gained fame in the 50s and 60s for his iconic portraits of celebrities, including a whole series of portraits of James Dean. So these 2 photographs are from his James Dean portfolio, which were they were taken right before the premiere of Dean's breakout role in East of Eden. So the image at the right he took first, they were wandering around Manhattan. And this is the kind of iconic image from the series of Dean walking in Times Square in the rain. And then the image at the left is at Dean's family farm in Indiana. And I've included them because even though he was a photojournalist, they kind of adopt a pictorialist aesthetic, or they're concerned with composition and lighting in a way that the pictorialists were concerned with those ideas. The decisions that Stock made about framing these scenes, about those diagonals that lead into the portrait at the left, or even the way that he altered the print on the right, and I'll talk about that a little more in a minute, it's kind of like a pictorialist thing to do. So, for example, in this image, this is not what the photograph originally looked like. I mean, when he first what the negative would look like. In the dark room, he did what is called dodging and burning. And dodging means you would put like a piece of cardboard or a tool, and you would interrupt the light that's coming from the enlarger or the light source, and you would interfere with the light before it hits the paper that you're exposing. And so when you do that, you create a lighter area on the print because you're preventing that part of the paper from getting exposed to as much light. And so if you look at this portrait of James Dean, notice how the gray in the background suddenly gets lighter when it surrounds his figure. It's almost like there's this kind of like haze, this lighter haze. Well, that's not what it actually looked like on that day in Times Square. He's emphasized he's made more contrast between Dean and his surroundings by dodging the background of this print and dodging even more in that shape around Dean's body, which creates this kind of like halo, this kind of around him, which is then, of course, really, I mean, he couldn't predict that Dean would die in a car crash about 6 months later, but we know that now. And so when we see this image, there's that kind of unnerving quality to it. Okay. I want to just close with maybe two more slides. So more than a century ago, the pictorialist images, publications, and exhibitions successfully argued for photography's acceptance as a fine art. Their claim that photography could be a vehicle for aesthetic and personal expression is now widely accepted. And today, anyone who has a cell phone can manipulate photographic images and create new art. This movement has led some photographers to even use the term the new pictorialism to describe Instagram and other apps. So pictorialism's legacy is evident not only in the works of contemporary artists in the gallery, but also, I think, in the work of every one of you. Anytime you use your cell phone to take a picture and then experiment with it. And I wanted to just show you, so this is, this image predated Photoshop, but it's, he's combined in the dark room these images of leaves that are floating above the seashore, and then dodged and burned. That same idea, dodging to make parts lighter in the print, and burning, which would make certain areas darker in the print, to create this contrasty image. And here, I just I just took a screenshot of Photoshop on my computer, and you have these same tools. So Photoshop in the 1990s was really taking this idea that you can take an image, you start with a photographic image, but you don't end there. You manipulate it from that point forward. And then I just wanted to close because I know that I think Debbie Fisher is on the call, and I don't know if Lisa Jobe was able to join us, but I wanted to share these two images. These are both by artists who attended OU in the 1980s. Debbie Fisher is now a jewelry designer in Brooklyn, and Lisa Jobe is a painter and illustrator and photographer on the East Coast. And when they were students here in the 1980s, late 80s, they were in photography courses with Andy Strout. And these two images are part of our collection, along with a whole portfolio that came from several of Andy's classes. And you can see both of them related to me that they were influenced by the work of pictorialist photographers like Julia Margaret Cameron, and also Edward Steichen. And I think Lisa Jobe's image on the left is particularly interesting because she told me that she's not interested in depicting reality, even today. So she made this photograph of her sister in 1986, but still today her work is mysterious, it's narrative, it's tends to be, in her own words, painterly, atmospheric, and tinged with a bit of fantasy, end quote. And so I think, you don't have to take it from me, you can take it from the artist's own mouths, that this aesthetic and the ideas that pictorialism espoused, more than a century ago, are still at play in the work of photographers and artists today. Okay, I'm going to skip. I just want to close on this image. So you can come to the exhibition, and you can be a cell phone pictorialist, as our learning and engagement area of the gallery states. And there are several apps you can download, and you can take your own portrait in front of our selfie wall and then alter it through these apps that are available for download, or you can take home a packet and paint on images that are in the exhibition. I thought that was a really kind of nice touch by our learning and engagement staff. So I am going to I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm just going to show you how to access the gallery if you're not in Norman and you want to visit virtually. And while you're doing that, if anyone wants to ask questions, I'd be happy to try to take a stab at those. Amanda, you can come back if you want.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hadley.
Okay, so this is, can you all see that? Or Amanda, can you see it? Since I guess I can't.
Yes.
Okay, so this is on our website. You just go to visit and then virtual tours. And then all of our exhibitions, current and recent past exhibitions are available here. And you can tour the space. You can zoom in and see the original image or the image that's in the gallery. And then there's a way to remove the text, and I'm not doing it right. Or you can also, you know, if you feel so inclined, you can read the label text too. But I would just encourage all of you to do this if you can't come in and see the gallery, the exhibition in person. I think that our prep staff did a really incredible job with the graphics and with the design of the exhibition. Okay, so I think I'm gonna stop sharing.
Sure. And I just wanted to add too that you can also see our entire permanent collection is available to view on the website as well, with the same Matterport kind of virtual visit. So thank you so much, Hadley, for digitally walking us through the exhibit. I know it's difficult in these times. It's actually kind of interesting to get to see it this way, because I think there's also the added benefit of seeing parts of the exhibition and the works that we wouldn't get to necessarily see in the exhibit space, like when you're able to show us the back of prints and things that have been matted over. So I think that's quite special. We do have a couple of questions that I would like to ask of you. Okay, so the first one from Jordan is asking, given their intense relationship, what do you think about the influence that O'Keeffe may have had on Steichen and Stieglitz, especially considering their views of pictorialism?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I think intense relationship's a good, good way to describe it. Well, it's interesting because their relationship is actually kind of later. So by the time, we think of Stieglitz, his photographs, especially of O'Keeffe's hands, but he moved on from pictorialism in the early 1910s and became really a proponent of straight photography. So sharply focused, highly detailed, modernist photography. I mean, what then became associated with modernism. So I'm not sure if there's a direct relationship between his work, especially his relationship with O'Keeffe and then pictorialism, because the pictorialism is really kind of earlier in his career, but certainly his influence on modernism. I mean, he was influential on photographic modernism, not just artistic modernism in the United States.
Definitely. Okay, let's see. We have another question from Marielle. She's asking, is pictorialism always associated with black and white imagery? At first, I thought they were black and white because there was no such thing as color photography, back when it began. But even the later photos that you were showing were all in black and white.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not everything, I should say, in the gallery is black and white. But early on, yeah, I mean, they weren't. You could get color, but it was in the printing. It wasn't in the negative. And so initially, yeah, I mean, everything in the gallery up to a certain point is black and white, but they were definitely playing with how to get color into their images. So and it was through printing. So the photogravures apparently don't really reproduce the kind of tones that you would get in the original prints and I wish, I just wish we had some of those, original, like Steichen's original print, because there would be like a warmth, there would be a tone. It wouldn't necessarily seem like as black and white as we would think, there would be like a tint to some of those prints. But yeah, there was like painting, hand painting and other kind of ways to get color into the images. And I think the more recent works, there were other things I could have put out. Actually, in the gallery, there are a few color works. So I don't want to say that it has to be black and white to be pictorialist, because for me, that it's more about the idea of altering an image. So you could start with a color photograph and alter it into something else, and then to me, that's still a pictorialist endeavor. It's just our collection doesn't necessarily support showing that work as well as it does showing the black and white work.
Right.
I'm constrained by what's in the vault.
Right, exactly. Got to work with what you got. Absolutely. That kind of brings me a little bit to a question someone on staff was asking earlier. And so she was asking if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the reason for kind of manipulating by hand some of the photographs. So like actually painting onto a photograph, so not during the development stage. And is that a practice that is still used today?
Well, you can do it if you take home one of the packets from our gallery.
Right.
Well, I don't know. I'm not the right person to ask. I think I would ask artists. I would ask, well, I think Lisa's work is kind of like that. Yeah, I mean, people do that. They hand color images now. So I would say yes.
Let's see. Okay, well, here's another question from Kenneth that is still along the same lines, and he's asking, what I guess you kind of already answered this a little bit. Can a color photograph then be considered pictorialist?
Yeah. I mean, what I kind of showcased more of the early 20th century material, and but yeah, color imagery could definitely be pictorialist. And one of the things I wanted to include in the exhibition is actually it's a hologram. It's called a scologram, and it's a color image that's projected, and it's not actually in the gallery. There's one right outside the gallery, so you can actually see it from the virtual tour if you kind of look through the second entrance back there towards the contemporary part of the gallery. You can see it, and yeah, it's more about the idea, that I'm going to start with a photographic image and then I'm going to push it in some way, and maybe that's that could take any number of forms.
Absolutely. Oh, we have a really great question from someone in California. Marilyn is asking, and you've asked the right person, is there a way to get a packet without going to the gallery? And this is the first time this has been asked. Right. And I would love to say, absolutely. You can email someone on staff. If you can find us on our contact page on the website, and just send us your address, and I would love to send you a packet, Marilyn. I think, you know what, Hadley, oh wait, there's one other question. Okay, so can you talk a little bit about what's going to be on view next in exhibition space?
Yeah, actually we just received from the Museum Association a fantastic new gift of photography. It's the entire series Nuclear Enchantment by Patrick Nagatani, an important American photographer. And we're going to put all of those, so it's 40 prints, and they deal with the nuclear energy in New Mexico. And actually, they would be a great example of, like pictorialism today, because he starts with a photographic image, and then he would make these kind of elaborate sets in his studio and re-photograph it, add color. I mean, they're fantastic kind of composite images. And those will be on view. We're going to open the exhibition in August, so you'll be able to see the whole series. And then also there's a short video that where he talks about his work. I'm really excited about that.
I think we all are, definitely. Well, I don't see any other questions, and it looks like we're out of time, so I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. I just want to say, from all of us on staff, we want to thank you, Hadley, for all of the work that you did to put together such a special exhibition about the legacy of pictorialism. If anyone hasn't yet had a chance to see the exhibit in person, it will continue to be on view until June 27th, so you still have a little time to get to the museum. And I do want to mention another virtual event we have coming up, and that is the next installment of our Coffee with the Collection program, taking place on Friday, May 21st at 9:30 a.m. We'll be looking at the painting Friday by Lenora Carrington. You can register for that event on the museum's events page on our website. And I'd like to, again, thank everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Hadley. And we hope you all have a wonderfully creative weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.